Whatever was written in former days was written for our instruction, so that by steadfastness and by the encouragement of the Scriptures we might have hope. Alleluia! The Holy Gospel according to St. Mark, the 8th chapter. Glory to you, Lord. Jesus went on with his disciples to the villages of Caesarea Philippi. And on the way he asked his disciples, "Who do men say that I am?" And they told him, "John the Baptist, and others say Elijah, and others, one of the prophets." But he asked them, "But who do you say that I am?" Peter answered him, "You are the Christ." And he charged them to tell no one about him. And he began to teach them that the Son of Man must suffer many things, and be rejected by the elders and the chief priests and the scribes, and be killed, and after 3 days rise again. And he said this plainly. And Peter took him and began to rebuke him, but turning and seeing his disciples, he rebuked Peter and said, "Get behind me, Satan, for you are not on the side of God, but of men." And he called to him the multitude with his disciples, and said to them, "If any man would come after me, let him deny himself, and take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever would save his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake and the gospel's will save it. For what does it profit a man to gain the whole world and forfeit his life? For what can a man give in return for his life? For whoever is ashamed of me and of my words in this adulterous and sinful generation, of him will the Son of Man also be ashamed, when he comes in the glory of his Father with the holy angels." The Gospel of the Lord. Praise to you, O Christ. Grace, peace, and much joy to you, people of God. St. Mark's Gospel gives us two stories of the healing of a blind man. The first is just before what we have as our Gospel for today. Jesus heals a blind man in Bethsaida. And the second one is just before the Palm Sunday triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Jesus heals blind Bartimaeus at Jericho. These two stories of the healing of blindness are the bookends of this section of St. Mark's Gospel, which we begin today. From Peter's confession to the Passion. With Peter's confession and the first prediction of the Passion and the Transfiguration, Mark's Gospel turns toward Jerusalem and the cross and the empty tomb. As Jesus begins to teach his disciples about the cross, he wants them to understand this turning, to see what's happening. And St. Mark wants us to see it too. He wants us to understand. And he thinks that the story of the healing of the blind man at Bethsaida will help. It's a healing story, much like the second healing story that we had last Sunday, the XVII miracle. Jesus again takes the sufferer away from those who brought him, away from the crowds, and heals him privately, using saliva again, as with the Ephphatha. But when he asks the man, "Can you see anything?" He says, I see men, but they look like trees walking. And Jesus lays his hands on him again, and he sees clearly. This two-part healing of sight is kind of like what's happening in today's gospel. Jesus begins by asking what others think about him, but then he takes his disciples away from the opinions of others and asks them the gospel question. The question that every single one of us who encounters Jesus, who encounters the story of Jesus, is asked. What do you think of him? Jesus asks, who do you say that I am? And before Mark took up his pen to write the story of Jesus and call that a gospel, the gospel in the earliest church simply meant those short creedal affirmations of who Jesus is that are at the center of the apostolic preaching. To distinguish an understanding of Jesus from the other possibilities. A great moral teacher, a wonder worker, wow, amazing, or a prophetic voice. Instead, Peter answers with a word we have not heard since chapter 1, verse 1. The Christ. You are the Christ. The anointed one. The Messiah. The royal son of David. Who will fulfill all the promises God made to David, to Israel through Moses, all the way back to Abraham. Now, to the disciples, that sounds like victory. The end of Roman oppression. The restoration of the kingdom of Israel. They see something, but they do not yet see clearly. And that's why they're astonished when Jesus silences them and tells them something that as citizens, well, not citizens, as residents of cities in the Roman Empire, they had seen all too often. The Son of Man, he says, has to be rejected. He has to be killed. He will on the third day rise. Peter takes him aside and rebukes him. This doesn't sound much like victory to him. But when Jesus in turn rebukes Peter, he calls him Satan. Because it's Satan sent all the way back at Jesus' temptation in the wilderness is the one who has been suggesting that there is a different way to go about being the Christ, being the Messiah, than that path which leads through rejection and suffering and the cross. And as if the point weren't quite difficult enough, Jesus then calls everyone and says, if you want to come after me, want to follow me, then take up your cross and follow me. Every single one of these people had seen this. The accusation and the condemnation by the powers that be. The Romans had perfected the ultimate, what we call in our day, the perp walk, as the person condemned to death carries the crossbeam of his own instrument of execution to the place of crucifixion. And then finally, that death by suffocation on the cross. This is what it means to follow. This doesn't look like victory. This is a hard saying. But Jesus says that to embrace his path, the path of the cross, is something that he must do. Jesus is the one who listens to the Father, who does the will of the Father, and who, though condemned and tortured and killed by the authorities that be, nevertheless turns this into his own act of self-sacrifice. He goes willingly to the cross because this is God's will for him. And this is the path to victory, to resurrection. And as he begins to teach the cost of discipleship to his hearers and to us, we understand, well, we don't understand, but we recognize the central paradox of Christianity. This whole business of finding by losing. In order for me to find the life that I will live in Christ, in the one who was crucified for me, such that my own life is hid with Christ in God, and I can say it is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. For me to live that baptized life, I have to first give up my old selfish life. The life that does not say, thy will be done. It says, my will be done. It says, why can I not be a Christian without really paying any price at all? And that's the temptation for us. That there is a path to our final destination in God, that there is a way of living the Christian life that does not involve bearing the cross. We don't have to go out looking for crosses. They come. But when they come, our calling is to embrace them as Jesus embraced his, recognizing that it is these things that drive my selfishness and self-centeredness out of me, that give me a life that is worth more than everything the world values. This is indeed a more difficult thing to understand than the identification of Jesus as the Christ. But it is Jesus' teaching of this paradox that is the second part of the healing of our spiritual side. That we see that to follow him, it must be so. Just as he knows that to follow the Father's will, it must be so. And paradoxically, this is the path where we walk with him, not only through the shadowy places of the threat of death, and maybe death, for Christianity has made many martyrs, but also even now and finally at the last, to walk in the presence of God in the land of the living. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy